Welcome to Pedo Teeth Talk, brought to you by the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, a podcast show that delivers cutting-edge ideas for the professionals specializing in pediatric dentistry.
Thank you for tuning in to Pedo Teeth Talk, where we bring you the contemporary issues important to you and your practice. Brought to you by the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry. I'm your host, Joel Burke. We're here today with Timothy Feddersen, talk about crisis management, ethics, and leadership. Professor Timothy Feddersen joined the faculty of Kellogg School of Management in 1995. He is the Wendell Hobbs Professor of Managerial Politics. Professor Henderson's research centers on information aggregation and elections, understanding how ethical values impact political behavior, the role of transparency in advisory committees, and the informal role of activists in the economy. Professor Feddersen teaches several classes at Kellogg, including leadership and strategic crisis management and values-based leadership. He has been a core faculty member for the AAPD's Leadership Institute at Kellogg since the beginning of the program. And I urge you to take a look at Professor Feddersen's full bio and CV online, and he will be referencing several things which will be posted online, including a recent webinar that he provided for many of the previous attendees of the Leadership Institute. So just one last item before I introduce Professor Feddersen and start to have a conversation. The AAPD's Leadership Institute has had 5 cohorts. We're starting our 6th, so in the 16th year now, he has influenced so many. And I personally recall having participated in the first cohort, how, Professor, you told us you hoped we never needed this information, and here we are today. So thank you for being with us today, Professor Feddersen.
Thank you, Joel. It's great to be with you and great to be back in touch with the AAPD.
Yeah, so I mean, as you and I were talking, we were prepping for this and talking about how can we get the most important messaging across. We were talking about how you were recently contacted by one of the Leadership Institute attendees who heard, as I did, your excellent information in the course on leadership, and they were trying to go through this situation and actually wrote you to talk about, are we in a crisis now? Are we in a crisis? I'll ask you.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. No, it's really interesting. It was a couple weeks ago, one of the participants in one of the previous Leadership Institutes at AAPD got in touch with me, Mira Albert, and she was trying to work through some real questions about what to do about her practice, whether to keep it open or close it, and was working back through. And she went back through her notes from crisis management and wanted to get in touch with me. And I thought it was such an interesting exchange that we had. She asked me, I'm trying to figure out whether we're in a crisis or not. And now, 2 weeks later, I think it's obvious that we are. There are lots of different definitions of crises, but whatever your definition of crisis is, I think we're certainly in one. We're in an emergency disaster kind of scenario. We can think of this as really a turning point for lots of industries, but from my perspective, the kind of the most important thing to think about when to ask yourself whether you're in a crisis or not goes back to a quote that I got from Dwight Eisenhower. It's a really famous quote, and that he gave a speech at Northwestern in 1954. And in that speech, he said, "What is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important." Well, this is Dwight Eisenhower, the chief, the commander-in-chief, and heading D-Day. But I thought, well, what's a crisis? A crisis is a set of decisions that are urgent and important, and so it's really interesting because you can be having a crisis, you can be facing urgent and important decisions, and maybe you're unaware that you are. Right, which is sort of the situation that we were in a couple weeks ago. But conversely, there are a lot of times when you feel like you're in crisis and you're not. And so the Eisenhower quote does kind of both those things. And Mira got me thinking about this, and I thought I should try to put together some material and get back in touch with the AAPD.
Yeah, well, we're glad you did, and I once again remind everyone we'll be posting this wonderful webinar you did that has helped so many people already. So once that determination is made, and it seemed like a rhetorical question to ask you that today, as you said 2 weeks ago, it might not have been a rhetorical question, are we in a crisis? What does one do once that determination is made? And I mean, do you need to actually make that determination? And regardless, what do you then do? You've talked about a protocol, a plan of action.
Yeah, this is really useful. I mean, really, the first thing is to start to recognize that you're in one, right?
Okay.
That you face an urgent and important decisions. And so what should you do? I mean, these create great uncertainty about some of the most important questions that we have, right? And so my first bit of advice, the starting point for everything is to just step back, take a breath, think about it a little bit, and write down what the core values are that should drive decision making right now. What are the core values that you want to drive decision making, whether that's in your personal life or for your practice? Because there's a lot of uncertainty about what should we do. And if you start from at least knowing what it is you're trying to do, you've got a big heads up.
So I think about, I'm sorry to interrupt, I'm thinking, people feel often frenetic in that mode. You sort of go into this frenetic phase of not pausing and taking time to make that list as you're describing.
Yeah, just do that. And then I think, I always try to tell people who are crisis management, you already know a lot about crisis management, actually, if you reflect on it, just that it comes from different parts of your life. That everybody in the AAPD, if you've gone through dental school, you have about preparing for medical crises of various sorts. And you think about, well, what do we do to prepare for those? And one of the most important things, if we have time in advance, is we try to build protocols that are going to speed decision making, that would allow us to make really important decisions faster with more confidence. And then the second thing that we want to think about is triage, right? Triage is something that should resonate with everybody in the medical profession. But if you just back up and say, well, what do I want to do? I want to do those things that are truly urgent and important first. Remembering that most things aren't both, right? So triage, values, build protocols.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So in the midst of all this information coming in and this sort of urgent state that one feels, and this urgent versus important analogy or statement is actually quite good, how do you balance the short-term immediate needs once you've made this determination versus what's going to potentially be damaging if you don't address it in the longer term? How do you distinguish between what you can delay and what you need to do right now?
Yeah, no, this is the essential problem is kind of what are the things that need to move up to the front of the line, right? And what are the things that you need to put and get to later? I recommend to people, let's try to think of both the short term and the long term kind of problems that we're going to face and try to prioritize them. And then give ourselves a sense of, well, when have we made the transition from, well, I'm working on this thing that's the most urgent and important right now. How do I know when to move to the next one? And also, it just always helps to step back and think about where's all this going to lead. I know you were talking about this. We were talking on the phone about the dental practices, and that a lot of kids aren't getting checkups now, but pretty soon, not too long, there's going to be a whole backlog of people who need just basic preventive dentistry. Right. And
they're all at home eating goldfish crackers. So let's get that in. So they're going to have a ton of cavities in 4 or 5 months.
So what is it going to take to be ready when things shift? How do I know when things are shifting? How do I know about how to sort of reopen and repower up my practice? How do I survive long enough to get there? Those are the important questions I have. But it all starts with values. Sort of what are you trying to do? What's the order? What's your order of business? How do you triage things? And you have to figure out what the values are that are driving. I would say it's really important to everyone out there who's got a dental practice. These are these are really important practices for the health of our community and our society. And taking steps to protect that practice and keep them viable is really something like a social duty, amidst all the other kinds of requirements too. And let me stop there.
Yeah, no, a couple of things I want to reflect on that you had just said. One is regarding the analogy of emergency management. Yes, we are all trained very well, particularly pediatric dentists, in managing a medical emergency that hopefully will never arise. But when it does, I think we're ready because we have protocols and systems. But I think as you and I were talking, the difference here is there is no protocol for us. I think next time maybe there will be. Hopefully, hopefully there won't be a next time in our lifetime. But what do you do? And what do you do when you don't even have a protocol? You don't even know where to go.
Joel, that's the great thing about our Leadership Institute and the crisis management that we do there. It's one of the things that we do is we give you a protocol for handling business crises. I can give it. I don't have time in this podcast to go through it. I'll just tell you. There are 3 steps: identify, contain, resolve. Figure out what the risks are. Figure out that you're in a crisis. Figure out who the key stakeholders are and what they value. This is important. Who are the key stakeholders? What do they value? What are the decisions that you have to make? What are the options that you have? And then contain is triage. Triage and aggregating information, figuring out what's going on, and then communicating. Setting triggers for, when have I moved from one stage to the next? When have I moved from one kind of concern to the next kind? Mm-hmm. How do I know? And then resolve, developing strategies and looking for partners. We want to make sure that we talk about just how important it is to communicate with key stakeholders. Mm-hmm. Too. That's a really big thing that we want to make sure that we talk about.
So in that case, it would be our patients, our staff, it's our professional community, the consumer. What else might you include in the stakeholder group?
Yeah, I think those are all right. I mean, don't forget yourself.
Yeah.
Right. Don't forget the partners. But try not just to ask sort of who the key stakeholders are, but ask yourself what are they most concerned about now? They might not be concerned about the same things that you are. What do they care about now? Right? Yeah. Because communicating with people, right? What people hear depends upon what they value. But if you don't understand what they value, you won't communicate with them very well.
So the 3 steps you referred to in your protocol, which, by the way, there's quite a bit of information more specifically in this webinar that we're posting about these things, of course. But when you talk about the 3 steps, that really applies to all the stakeholders. You almost have to kind of walk through that exercise with each of the stakeholders.
I can think about that too. Remember now, I'm facing urgent and important decisions, so I've got a triage, right? The trouble with crisis is that I don't have, if it's really a crisis, I just don't have enough time. So, and this is another thing that's so difficult for people is that the decisions are really important. Sometimes they're existential, literally, and sometimes they're existential for organizations. And we're pressed for time and information. These are just huge struggles. Be kind and gentle to yourself now, and understand that you face some of the hardest decisions you have to make. And Joel, if I know I hope I'm not kind of lecturing too much, but there's one last thing that I want to make sure that people do.
We could use your sage advice, so the lecturing is okay here, by the way. Yeah,
is build trust, mm-hmm. right? It's important to communicate, build trust, demonstrate expertise, demonstrate commitment to the values that you've articulated. Be transparent. That doesn't mean that you share everything. It means that you share relevant information to stakeholders. And if there's one thing that that is the central thing to a successful crisis management, it's empathy. Empathy is understanding other people's values and demonstrating that you understand their values. So building trust, that's about 50% of it. If you missed everything else I said, if you can just do the empathy part, you're way ahead.
Yeah, and you said at the beginning you list your core values, and then it's, as you just said, also understanding the values of others, and the empathy comes by connecting with their values along with your own. So just reflecting back on that listing of your core values, as one should partake in, as you just mentioned, how do you balance fulfilling legal requirements, and you have to even identify what they are, the ethical considerations, and just survival during a crisis?
Yeah, so this is about going back to what's important. What are the important concerns? I mean, the legal and the business kinds of concerns are going to be essential for sort of your long-term survival. But we're also in the middle of a pandemic here, of a health crisis, and so in some sense, we're going to put, in an emergency disaster like this, we're going to put human life and the protection of human life and health up higher, maybe than some of the others. So we want to be aware of kind of legal concerns and legal risks. We want to take those into account, and obviously they're essentials. But the answer to what we should do depends on really being clear about what it is we're trying to do in our values. And it may be that some of the legal questions that you have are important, but you're gonna get to them. They're maybe they're not as urgent, right? Those questions, and even as important as they are, right?
Yeah. So what about, to shift for a moment, about anticipating other potential crises that could evolve from the current crisis? How much time should we, we're kind of have to be in the present to enact those pieces of advice you give us in terms of the steps to take now. But in doing things, we could be ignoring things that aren't important today, but will be very important 3 months from now. I used to tell the residents that, if a child, God forbid, is in a motor vehicle accident and they break their arms and they have a couple broken bones and maybe some bleeding, they also knocked out a couple of teeth that are aesthetically and functionally very important. Well, at the time of when they get to the hospital, the teeth may not be the most important thing, but once it's determined they're going to be healthy and fine a week later, the teeth are the most important thing. So I guess that's sort of an analogy. So
that's it's a fantastic analogy, right? That we understand. We don't want to lose sight of really important things, and it's maybe the question about the teeth are just as important. They're or more perhaps, but just not as urgent. But
right.
but it really helps to keep in mind that there are really important things that we've just put on the back burner, so we have to get back to them. We were talking about this over the weekend when we were getting ready for this, and you were telling me, it's altogether possible that the landscape, the strategic landscape for dental practices is going to evolve and change quite a bit.
Yes.
I think getting information from the AAPD and thinking about this and networking with your colleagues and spending some time thinking about what that landscape is going to look like, you can think about how to position yourself as you go along the crisis path to be well situated for that, what you think is going to be a new emerging landscape.
So we just have to think about it. And I think we're going to be looking at that ourselves. We're going to be talking with you in a continual conversation and looking at other experts for, once we emerge from this, what's next and what do we do now? And I think there's a lot of questions and a lot of promise and a lot of great things that will evolve from a crisis. I want to conclude with what I think is one of the biggest takeaways I had in talking to you, Professor, over the weekend, and that was, as someone, as yourself, who's been involved in teaching crisis management and values-based leadership, what does it mean to lead especially now in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a wonderful question, and I think we started by talking about Mira Albert and how she reached out, and you mentioned that she hadn't posted very much and been very visible, but when this came up, she did a lot of deep thinking and worked at and had some really valuable ideas. And leaders step up. If you know what to do, what we need you to do is lead. We need you to go faster, maybe even than you'd like to, so that other people can see what you're doing and cue off you. If you're not sure what to do, go slower and follow. But if you know what to do, lead. And that's the great thing about the AAPD and its Leadership Institute. You have a lot of leaders, but you have to have courage to step up. It's really scary.
Yeah,
it's a really scary thing to do. So there's one last thing that I want to get to on the leadership front, and that is the importance of leaning out, right? Of recognizing that as much as your personally or your practice or your organization is in crisis, the magnitude of this situation is so vast and the problem so great. What we need leaders to do is aspire to make a difference. Because how can we make a difference in the big scheme of things? When we started, I mentioned the Eisenhower quote.
Yes.
Right? That, and I think if I were going to, sort of an ending point from my perspective, as a quote, a bookend, let's say anyway.
Yeah.
Right, it's a quote from Winston Churchill. And Churchill said in 1940, right at the onset of World War II, he said, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that people will say this was their finest hour." Just reflect on that. This is our moment now.
Yeah.
And so that's the leadership part. We're not sure what's going to happen. There may be some dark days and uncertainty ahead, but we're going to brace ourselves to do our duties.
I love that. It's touching. It's unifying. It brings us together across generations. And hearing your words and using those bookends to establish those links. So, Professor Feddersen, thank you so much for taking your time and talking with us today. I really appreciate it, and our audience is going to benefit. And I urge them to please listen to the webinar and to take a look at the other references we will be posting on the website. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joel. It's been my pleasure. All right, stay well, everyone.
Yes, you too. And thank you for tuning in to Pedo Teeth Talk, where we bring you the contemporary issues important to you and your practice, brought to you by the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry. We'll see you here next time.
Pedo Teeth Talk is brought to you by the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, the show that delivers cutting-edge ideas for the professional specializing in pediatric dentistry. If you have any questions or comments, please email info@aapd.org. We welcome your ideas for future shows and guests. For more information on the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, visit aapd.org.